At 0612 local time, this Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot was on a mission that was insane even by Ukrainian standards. A low-altitude strike on a key bridge through the most drone-saturated airspace on Earth. But what he'd discover about Russia's newest weapon would change how every air force on the planet thinks about air combat. The mission briefing said this corridor was open. It was wrong, and he was about to find out at 900 kilometers per hour. The MiG-29 screamed east so low that the frozen fields beneath him blurred into a gray-brown smear. This was the approach. Friendly rear areas first, then the gray zone where control changed by the hour. 35 kilometers to the release point. 15 minutes of low-level flight through airspace that intelligence had mapped, that ground controllers had deconflicted, and was supposed to be survivable. The air around him was riddled with other aircraft. Above, between 100 and 300 meters, Ukrainian and Russian reconnaissance drones tracked movement across the front. Below, hugging the deck at 20 to 50 meters, FPV attack drones from both sides hunted man and machine in an endless robotic war. The pilot was threatening the gap between them, 50 meters, right in the middle, a corridor where friendly traffic had been temporarily grounded and enemy activity was supposed to be minimal. And that's when his launch warning system screamed. The sound was wrong. Not the rhythmic pulse of a search radar finding him, not the urgent warble of a sandlock. This was a single sharp tone. Missile guidance, already active, already tracking. Something had shot at him, and he hadn't seen it coming. The pilot reacted on instinct. Stick back, throttle forward, flares punching into the slipstream. The MiG's nose pitched up as the G-forces crushed him into his ejection seat. He was climbing, loss of terrain masking at 100 meters, 150, 200, trading his invisibility for the chance to outrun whatever was behind him. The missile, if it was a missile, didn't catch him. No impact, no explosion. Just the fading scream of whatever had been tracking him lost lock in the flare cloud. But now he was at 300 meters, exposed, and his RWR was lighting up with new threats. A Buk battery to the south painting him, an S-300 somewhere to the east. He jumped out of one trap and into another. Then he saw them. Two shapes, maybe 3 kilometers out, silhouetted against the gray morning sky. Delta wings, 3.5-meter wingspan, moving slow, loitering, turning toward him. Juran 2 drones. The color left his face. He'd been briefed on this, the new Russian tactic that had started in December. They'd begun strapping R-60 air-to-air missiles to their Juran 2 reconnaissance drones, turning surveillance platforms into hunters designed specifically for one purpose, swatting Ukrainian aircraft flying at low-altitude strike missions exactly like the one he was flying right now. The R-60 was infrared guided. His radar warning receiver couldn't see the launch. The first missile had come out of nowhere because there was no radar to warn him. Just a heat seeker dropped from a drone that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Garans were turning toward him. If they had more missiles, he was about to find out. He rolled hard and dove, dumping flares, trying to break their angle. At 200 meters, he was still too high. The Buk radar was tracking him, building a solution. And if he stayed up there much longer, it would fire. But the Garans were above him now, and going lower meant giving them a perfect shot at his engines. Another white flash. The second one has fired. The pilot shoved the stick forward and dove for the deck, afterburners screaming, flares streaming behind him like a comet tail. The R-60s were old missiles, first-generation seekers, distractible, not particularly smart. He leveled at 40 meters, so low he could see individual fence posts whipping past. His RWR showed the Buk still radiating but not launching. He dropped below their engagement envelope, so low that the radar couldn't see him anymore because of terrain which bought himself a few seconds of safety. Above him, the missile was chasing heat signatures that weren't attached to his aircraft anymore. The second R-60 also detonated on flares. The Garans, now out of ammunition, continued their lazy orbit. They couldn't shoot him themselves, not anymore, but they reported his position to something much worse. The pilot exhaled. He was alive. He was also completely off course. The evasion had pushed him north, away from the planned corridor, into airspace that hadn't been deconflicted. His heading was wrong, his altitude was wrong, and when he keyed his radio to request a new vector, the response came back in fragments. Corridor compromised. Working alternate. Then static. It sounded like ground control was running a marathon underwater. In the busiest battlefield on Earth, right now he was suddenly alone. The pilot checked his instruments, tried to reorient. The release point was still out there, 22 kilometers east. The mission was still valid. He just had to get there through airspace that nobody had cleared and nobody could see. He turned east and pushed the throttle forward. And that's when he saw the drones. FPVs, a stream of them, maybe 200 meters ahead, crossing his flight path at his altitude. Small, fast, dark against the gray sky. Russian strike drones heading toward Ukrainian positions, or Ukrainian interceptors chasing Russian drones. He couldn't tell, and it didn't matter, because at 900 kilometers per hour, he was closing in on them at 250 meters per second, and there was nothing he could do but fly through. They passed beneath him, above him, around him. He wasn't sure. By the time his eyes registered movement, the drones were already behind him, and the new ones were appearing ahead. The pilot's hands tightened around the stick. This was the nightmare scenario, the one the briefers talked about but nobody had solutions for. The Pokrovsk sector had become the most drone-saturated airspace in human history. 20 FPVs per mile of frontage on a slow day. But right now, he was caught in the Pokrovsk equivalent of Black Friday as both Ukrainian and Russian drones flew toward each other's lines. The only thing he could do was go forward. His eyes strained against the canopy, trying to pick out shapes against the winter sky. The FPVs were 30 centimeters across, dinner plates with rotors. At this speed, at this distance, they were invisible until they weren't. He was covering a football field every 4/10 of a second. If one appeared in his windscreen, he'd have time to flinch and nothing else. His NO-19 radar was useless. It was designed for fighter-sized targets, not objects with the radar cross-section of a hot dog. His infrared search and track couldn't see cold plastic and lithium batteries. Every instrument in his cockpit had been built for a different war. The only sensors that mattered now were his Mark I Mod 1 eyeballs, and they weren't fast enough. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. Vector 090. Heavy activity above 60 meters. Stay below 5. Below 50, he nudged the stick forward, dropping to 45 meters. The ground was a blur beneath him. At this altitude, power lines and cell towers were the least of his worries. The fiber optic cables that Russian drone operators trailed behind their FPVs, hair-thin wires that photographers had captured draped across Pokrovsk ruins like spider silk. Those could take him out in the blink of an eye. One into his intake could shred his compressor. He'd never see it coming. Another broken transmission. Ukrainian interceptors active. Airspace contested. Recommended. Ukrainian interceptors. His own side drones were now in the mix, chasing Russian FPVs, adding more objects to airspace that was already saturated. Ground control was trying to find him a path, but their picture was minutes old, and the situation was evolving by the second. At 900 kilometers per hour, a safe vector for 3 minutes ago might as well be ancient history. Then, a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Close. Too close. An FPV, maybe 50 meters away, crossing left to right. He didn't have time to react before it was behind him. Then another, below, almost skimming the frozen fields. Then a cluster, ahead and high, black specks against the gray sky. The pilot made a decision. He couldn't stay down there. Every second in this altitude band was a dice roll against collision. The mission was still 15 kilometers ahead, and the odds of reaching it through this swarm were getting worse by the second. There was only one way out. He shoved the throttle past the detent into full afterburner. His engines roared as raw fuel dumped into the exhaust. The MiG surged forward, G-forces pressing him back, acceleration climbing past 1,100 kilometers per hour. Then he pulled back on the stick and started climbing. Early, before the initial point, before the planned release parameters, he was punching out of the swarm the only way he could, up and out, trading invisible drone threats for visible radar ones. A Russian Buk found him immediately. His RWR lit up as the Fire Dome tracking radar locked on, painting him with energy that would guide a missile straight to his cockpit. He was at 500 meters, then 1,000, then 2,000. The radar held him the entire way, building a firing solution, calculating where he'd be in 10 seconds. The toss bombing maneuver he was attempting was a relic from the Cold War, designed for nuclear-armed fighter bombers that needed to throw gravity bombs at targets without flying directly overhead. The physics were simple. Climb at a steep angle, release at the top, let momentum carry the weapons to target while you dove for safety. American and Soviet pilots had practiced it for decades against imaginary enemies. Nobody had practiced it while a Buk-M3 was actively tracking them and drones flew past you at hyperspeed. The textbook said this maneuver required a clear threat environment. The textbook had clearly never been to Pokrovsk. The pilot held his climb, 2,500 meters, 3,000. The Buk could fire at any second, and he'd have maybe 8 seconds to figure out his life choices. But if he broke off now, he'd have to fly back through the swarm with nothing to show for it. The mission was still valid. The bridge was still there. His ground forces were counting on him. 3,500 meters. His iPad showed release parameters approaching. The Buk radar was still tracking, still building its solution, and the pilot understood with cold clarity that he was betting his life on a math problem. Could he release the bombs and dive below the radar horizon before the missile caught him? 4,000 meters. The iPad flickered yellow. Close enough. His thumb found the weapons release. Two thuds shook the airframe as the AASM Hammers fell away. The pilot was already moving. Stick forward, rolling inverted, pulling through a split S that would have failed him in flight school. The MiG's nose dropped toward the earth as he traded altitude for speed, diving at an angle that pushed the airframe toward structural limits. Behind him, the bomb's rocket motors ignited with a flash, pushing them toward Mach 0.8, beginning their 15-kilometer flight to the bridge. The Buk fired. His RWR screamed the launch warning as a 9 M317M missile roared off its rail somewhere to the south, accelerating to Mach 4 in seconds. The pilot didn't see it. His face was down toward the earth, altimeter unwinding, 3,500, 3,000, 2,500, trying to put the planet's curve between himself and the radar that was guiding the missile toward him. The 9 M317M is a semi-active homing missile. It didn't carry its own radar. It followed reflective energy from the fire dome illuminator, chasing the brightest spot in the sky. Same principle as the cat follows a laser pointer on the wall, just not so cute and funny. If the pilot could break that illumination, the missile would go blind. The only way to break illumination was to drop below the radar horizon. The math was brutal. Missile closing at 1,400 meters per second. Distance approximately 8 kilometers. Time to impact, 6 seconds, maybe 7. Time to reach terrain masking altitude at this dive angle, 5 seconds, maybe 6. 1 second of margin, maybe. The pilot held the dive, 2,000 meters, 1,500. The airframe was shaking now, buffeting at the edge of controllability. 1,000 meters. He could see individual trees below him, individual buildings, the texture of frozen fields rushing up. At 600 meters, he started the pullout. G-forces crushed him into his seat, graying his vision. But he held the pull because leveling out a second too early meant the radar would still see him and the missile would still track. At 200 meters, wings level, he was racing west at maximum dry power. His RWR showed the fire dome searching, hunting, and then nothing. He dropped below the horizon. The illumination was gone. The 9 M317M Seeker lost lock 3 seconds before impact. Its guidance computer commanded the last-ditch climb, proximity fuse arming, searching for anything to hit. It found empty air. The warhead detonated 300 meters above the Ukrainian countryside, fragments raining down on frozen fields. The pilot exhaled. He was alive, his bombs were flying, and he was about to do something monumentally stupid. The only way home was west, back through the swarm he'd just escaped. The safe corridor that was supposed to carry him home didn't exist anymore. The only option was to retrace his path through airspace that was still saturated with drones he couldn't see. He dropped to 40 meters and punched west. 15 kilometers behind him, 2 French bombs were fighting a war of their own. The AASM Hammers had separated cleanly, their rocket motors burning for 15 seconds before exhaustion, pushing them to Mach 0.8 along a ballistic arc toward the bridge coordinates. Each bomb was essentially 3 weapons in one. GPS guidance and ring laser gyroscopes in the nose, solid rocket motor in the middle, control surfaces on the tail that could adjust 50 times per second. The French had designed them to put 250 kilograms of explosive through a specific window from 70 kilometers away. But the French had designed them for a world where GPS signals arrived clean. The R-330CH Seidel stations blanketing Pokrovsk had been jamming satellite navigation for months. Every precision weapon dropped in this sector experienced degradation. JDAM ERs drifting off target, drone navigation going haywire, artillery shells guided by GPS missing by dozens of meters. The jamming was constant, pervasive, and brutal. Inside each bomb's guidance package, the military GPS receivers were fighting for signal. They were hardened units, more resistant than civilian systems, designed to operate in contested electromagnetic environments. But resistance wasn't immunity. Position errors were accumulating. Small at first, centimeters of drift, then meters. The bomb's onboard computers recognized the degradation and did exactly what their French engineers had designed them to do. The ring laser gyroscopes at the heart of each guidance package had been measuring acceleration since before release, building a mathematical model of position based purely on physics. No satellites required, no external signals needed, just the memory of where they'd started and the laws of motion calculating where they were. The trade-off was precision. GPS guided, the AASM could hit within 1 meter. On inertial navigation alone, accuracy degraded to 10 meters. Still good, still lethal, but the difference between a direct hit and a near miss was now about 50-50, and the pilot had the same odds as he crossed back into the drone swarm. The drones were still there, FPVs swarming in patterns that made no sense. Ukrainian interceptors mixed with Russian strike platforms. Chaos layered on chaos. His radio was still cutting in and out. Ground control still trying to find him a path through an airspace that was changing faster than anyone could track. He didn't climb this time. He couldn't. The Buk had already proven it could track him, and he didn't have the fuel for another afterburner run. The only way through was straight and low and fast, eyes straining against the canopy, praying that the odds stayed in his favor. At 900 kilometers per hour, he was covering 250 meters every second. A drone appearing at 500 meters gave him 2 seconds of warning. Not enough time to evade, barely enough time to flinch. His eyes tracked every shadow, every shape, every flicker of movement against the gray sky. His hands were steady on the controls, but his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. A shape crossed his nose at maybe 100 meters, then another. Below, skimming the frozen fields. He flew through their wake and kept going because stopping wasn't an option and turning wasn't possible, and the only direction that led home was forward through the swarm. His radio crackled. Impact 30 seconds. Track nominal. The bombs were still flying. The bridge was still the target. Somewhere behind him, 2 French weapons were threading through the same jamming that had been blinding Ukrainian precision munitions for months. Their gyroscopes doing the math that GPS couldn't. 20 seconds. An FPV appeared directly ahead, 50 meters, maybe less, crossing right to left. The pilot jerked the stick instinctively, a micro-correction that was too late to matter. The drone was behind him before his hands finished moving. He was still flying, still alive. 10 seconds. He was almost through. The drone density was thinning as he approached friendly airspace. Ground control's voice came through clearer now, the jamming weaker on this side of the line. Roadrunner 2-4, impact imminent. Stand by for BDA. 5 seconds. The pilot crossed into Ukrainian-controlled airspace at 0617. He didn't see the impact. He was 20 kilometers away, racing west at 800 kilometers per hour. Fuel state amber, hands shaking on the stick. But he heard the call. Impact. Impact. 15 kilometers behind him, 2 AASM Hammers had struck the eastern span of the Pokrovsk bridge.